Hello everyone! In this video we are going to talk about the Prose Edda and the short story Thorstein Staffstruck. So we're kind of moving further into medieval literature now. We're going to examine a couple of key pieces of, or examples of rather, medieval Scandinavian, specifically Icelandic storytelling. So let's talk about some Scandinavian sagas. We've got the Prose Edda, we've got the Poetic Edda, we might have the Elder Edda, we've got King's sagas, we've got sagas coming out our ears. We love sagas. So primarily most medieval Old Norse storytelling, if it was written down, was part of one saga or another. Very little extant literature from this time period and culture is just sort of written as a short piece or as just a little blurb, or is otherwise cut short. Most of it is in one way or another tied to a saga. So we're going to be working specifically with the Prose Edda. Now the Prose Edda is a 13th century Icelandic saga written in the Old Norse language. It was compiled by a sort of writer, educator, government official type named Snorri Sturluson. And it was compiled from older stories and tales and partially, the Poetic Edda and the Elder Edda. But this is really where we get all of the versions of Norse myths that we know. This is where they all come from. So this is where we get, the original stories about Odin and Thor and Freya and Ragnarok and Fenrir and all of that. We don't really have Avengers without Snorri Sturluson, if you think about it, which is kind of awesome. Now, with the title Edda, we don't actually know 100% what it means or where it comes from. There are a ton of options that maybe it's derived from some different Old Norse words or potentially from some different Latin words. There are a lot of options, so it's not, it ultimately doesn't really matter what the word Edda actually means. It's just what we call this text. So the Prose Edda, we need to differentiate from the Poetic Edda. Now the Poetic Edda is a different sort of structure. It does contain many of the same stories, but the Poetic Edda is more of a collaborative work. It doesn't really have as much authorial interruption as the Prose Edda does. We don't know if there was one author for the Poetic Edda. It could have been one of those texts that was sort of compiled by monks and writers and skalds and poets sort of over the decades and centuries. But it does seem to have been compiled from an older oral poetic work, which we sometimes call the Elder Edda. Now, there is only one place that we get the Poetic Edda from, which is from the Codex Regius from about 1270. So we only have one copy of the Poetic Edda, which means that we don't really have things like, alternate translations, alternate interpretations, sort of varying structures to work with. We have literally just the one text, kind of like how we only have just the one Beowulf text. So also, much like Beowulf, the Poetic Edda is written in alliterative verse. And finally, the Poetic Edda is quoted extensively by Snorri Sturluson, but he doesn't take the Prose Edda directly from the Poetic Edda. And I know that sort of sounds weird because when we just say Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, it kind of sounds like one is just in a poetic form and one is in a prose form. But it's a little more complicated than that. The Prose Edda in many ways follows the format of a florilegium, which is sort of a medieval anthology or a collection of literary excerpts. Really, our textbook for this class you could consider a florilegium because it contains whole texts, but also excerpts, commentaries, remarks on the text, further reading suggestions. So a florilegium is really an anthology, and in some ways, the Prose Edda follows this structure as well. So the Prose Edda is divided into 4 sections, and we're not going to read parts of all of them, but we're just going to read a little bit of part 2 to get a sense of some of the way that Sturluson sort of talks about the mythology and how he approaches the text. So these 4 sections start with the prologue, and this tells the Christian creation story and then explains how the figures known as the Norse gods came to be. Now, Sturluson argues that they were actually refugees from the city of Troy after the Trojan War, so he takes a very Aeneid, kind of Virgil style approach. But then he says that these figures came to Scandinavia and that they were so powerful and so sort of wise and good at fighting that they later kind of became mistaken for gods. So that's sort of how Sturluson gets around being able to tell these very pagan stories in a very Christian context, is that he kind of pulls a Virgil and says, well, they're not really gods, they're just great mythic heroic figures. So the second part of the text is, and I'm absolutely going to get these pronunciations wrong, please forgive me, Kilvakinning. And this is where most of the Norse mythology that we're so familiar with comes from. This is those specific stories about, Freya and her cats, and Fenrir biting off Tyr's hand, and Ragnarok, and Baldur's death, and Loki being Loki. The third part is Skoltskarpamal, and this section is really heavily dialogic. Sturluson creates sort of a dialogue between himself and another figure, and he blends mythology with his own commentary. And finally, the last section is Háthathal, and that's where Sturluson discusses poetry and poetic forms. And it's sort of half descriptive, half prescriptive. He spends about half his time describing the way that people write, and about half of his time providing a handbook for poets and writers. So you can see here how this really is kind of providing that kind of anthologized structure. And you can really almost think about it in a little bit of a textbook sense, in the sense that he is providing stories of his culture, he is commenting on it, and he is also giving instruction for how to write. So that's about all that I have for you in terms of the Prose Edda. Again, this is really just to get a sense of why this text matters in the context of its culture, why it matters to us today, and then sort of what the kind of thematic preoccupations of the author were. But in order to really dig deeply into those thematic preoccupations, we're going to turn to Thorstein the Staff-Struck. I'm going to mess that up so many times. Thorstein the Staff-Struck. And Thorstein the Staff-Struck comes from a different sort of literature altogether. This is and I'm going to get this wrong, thauter. This little mark right here is called a thorn, and it's a soft TH sound. So this is thauter, th. So a thauter literally translates as a strand, like a strand of rope or yarn, and just this name alone tells us a lot about how this story is meant to be thought of. And Thatir are sort of a short story genre from the 13th and 14th centuries, but we'll find out shortly why calling them short stories isn't really accurate. Thatir were thought for a long time to be, like I said, short stories that existed in collections like the King's Sagas, but again, the very word thauter, in its meaning as a strand, suggests that what they are is smaller parts of a larger whole, kind of smaller interconnected narratives that exist inside of a larger narrative and are not meant to be anthologized in the same way or thought of as just merely a collection. And they certainly aren't meant to stand alone. So a similar framework might be to consider Ovid's Metamorphoses, where you can sort of take each tale on its own and it has some meaning, but that when you look at the way that they're structured, when you look at the way they're organized, Ovid is very intentionally weaving them together thematically and sometimes even narratively through the use of things like frame stories. So the King's Sagas and the Thatir are very similar to this concept, where you can, if you want, look at each story independently, but they're much more meaningful when taken as part of a larger whole. And unfortunately, we don't have enough space to really examine this whole, but we do have enough, there is still enough stuff in each story to make some meaning out of it. So narratively, Thorstein the Staff-Struck is about feuding families and intergenerational conflict. It tells the story of our hero, Thorstein, who is experiencing some hardships. He is the farming son of a Viking father who gets in a fight over a horse fight and gets hit by another character. Now, he doesn't respond to this blow, which in this culture is a huge deal because he's not defending his honor. So the story kind of continues from there with these kind of, conceptions of what it means to be an honorable person, what it means to defend one's honor. The story draws very heavily on the aggressive, very proactive culture of the era. Think about the heroic code of Beowulf and the things that it required from its adherents or its cultural participants. This is still a very similar culture. But the story really gets at sort of an era of culture shift. And in this case, the shift from kind of pagan culture to Christian culture. The story also makes heavy use of the practice of nicknaming, which in medieval Norse culture could either be really delightful, drawing more word fame and honor towards a person, or it could be demeaning, in which case the person's honor had to be revenged. And there are lots of stories about people getting demeaning or teasing nicknames and then going on murder sprees because the paramount thing for a medieval Scandinavian was their personal honor. So that concept of revenge, that concept of getting your own back, of cycles of violence is absolutely core to understanding Thorstein thematically. Specifically, the name Staff-Struck contains a couple of gendered insults. It can also mean staff-smitten, and then, staff itself is a little bit of a euphemism, if you will. The medieval Norse made really heavy use of gendered insults, and a lot of this is tied to conceptions of gender in medieval Scandinavia, wherein your sense of sort of gendered honor was also very tied to the sense of being sort of an active and proactive rather than passive person. For instance, it was considered acceptable in pre-Christian Scandinavia to engage in like homosexual relationships as long as no one thought that you were the sexually passive partner. So you can see how that might tie into this concept of shame and of kind of personal honor and always having to be responding to any kind of threat to that personal honor. So the story also makes use of intergenerational conflicts where Thorstein is kind of at odds with his father constantly. His father used to be a Viking, his father used to go on raids, and Thorstein is a farmer. He wants to live a peaceful life, and that may even be how the conflict begins, where he doesn't think that it's worth his time to respond to a blow that he is struck because he thinks that it was a worthwhile blow and that the cycle of violence can just kind of end where it does. But this story also centers the conflict between the old pagan value system, represented by Thorstein's father, and the new Christian value system, represented by Thorstein himself. So finally, here are some questions to ask yourself as you read, or to ask yourself now that you have read, depending on where you are. Why does Thorstein keep the blow secret from his family and his father and his community? What role does the horse fight play in the conflict or narrative? How does Bjarni also suffer shame? And how are Thorstein and Bjarni stuck in the same shameful situation? And how does this help resolve the story's conflict? So again, we're really thinking about these sort of public perceptions of yourself. How does the community view you? And what do you need to do in order to make sure that the community looks well at you? So you can really see how, these are kind of the main cultural issues at play here for this time and place. If you have any questions, as always, please don't hesitate to let me know. See ya!